You're stuck. Not because you lack motivation or discipline, not because you haven't read enough self-help books or attended enough therapy sessions. You're stuck because there are psychological structures operating beneath your conscious awareness that are specifically designed to keep you exactly where you are. And the most disturbing part, you built them yourself. Carl Jung spent decades studying patients who seemed incapable of change despite desperately wanting it. People who understood their patterns intellectually but couldn't break them. Who knew what they needed to do but couldn't make themselves do it. Who could articulate their problems with stunning clarity yet remain trapped in the same cycles year after year. And what Jung discovered challenged everything the psychiatric community believed about human resistance to change. These people weren't weak-willed or self-sabotaging in the way everyone assumed. They were being held back by specific psychological blocks that Jung identified as fundamental structures of the unconscious mind. These blocks weren't random. They weren't character flaws. They were protective mechanisms that had calcified into prisons. And the reason most people never escape them is because they're trying to overcome blocks they don't even know exist. Today I'm going to show you the major psychological blocks Jung identified that keep people trapped in patterns they consciously want to escape, why your attempts to overcome them through willpower or positive thinking are actually making them stronger, and what Jung discovered about the only way these blocks actually dissolve. Because if you've been trying to change something about yourself for years without success, you're not failing. You're fighting an invisible architecture that was specifically designed to resist exactly what you're trying to do. Jung's investigation into psychological blocks began with a question his colleagues thought was naive. If people genuinely want to change, why don't they? The standard psychiatric answer was lack of motivation or unconscious desire to remain sick. But Jung observed something more complex. His patients were genuinely suffering. They genuinely wanted relief. But something in their psyche was actively preventing the very changes that would end their suffering. So Jung started mapping what he called the psychological immune system, the unconscious structures that protect the ego from threats, even when those threats are positive changes. And what he found was that the human psyche doesn't evaluate threats based on whether they're objectively good or bad. It evaluates them based on whether they're familiar or unfamiliar. And any change, even positive change, registers as threat to a system built entirely around maintaining psychological homeostasis. The first major block Jung identified was what he called ego rigidity. This is the psychological structure that makes your sense of self feel fixed and unchangeable. Your ego, the organizing center of your conscious mind, has constructed an identity based on years of experience, relationships, and reinforcement. And this identity feels like who you fundamentally are. But Jung discovered it's actually just a provisional construction that your psyche is desperately defending as if it were permanent truth. Here's how ego rigidity operates. You have a self-concept. Let's say part of that self-concept is, I'm someone who struggles with relationships. This isn't just a belief. It's woven into your entire psychological structure. Your memories are organized around it. Your explanations for past events depend on it. Your predictions about future behavior assume it. It's become load-bearing architecture in your psyche. Now imagine you start doing deep work and begin developing healthier relationship patterns. You'd think your ego would celebrate this growth, but Jung found the opposite happens. Your ego experiences this change as an existential threat Because if you're no longer someone who struggles with relationships, then who are you? The self-concept that organized your entire psychological reality is dissolving, and dissolution feels like death. So ego rigidity kicks in. Suddenly you'll find yourself unconsciously sabotaging the new patterns, or dismissing evidence of change, or finding reasons why this growth isn't real or won't last. Not because you don't want to change, because your ego has identified change as a threat to its existence and is defending itself the only way it knows how, by reasserting the old identity as fixed truth. Jung emphasized that this block is nearly invisible to the person experiencing it. You don't feel your ego defending itself. You just feel like the change isn't working or isn't real. You experience the resistance as objective reality rather than as psychological defense. And this invisibility is what makes ego rigidity so powerful. You can't fight a block you don't know is operating. The second major block Jung documented was the compensation mechanism. This one's particularly insidious because it masquerades as health while actually preventing real change. Jung observed that when people have an inferior or underdeveloped part of their personality, their psyche automatically overcompensates in the opposite direction to maintain balance. Think about someone who has massive insecurity underneath their surface personality. Their psyche can't allow that insecurity to be consciously felt because it would be destabilizing. So it creates a compensation, aggressive confidence, superiority, dominance. The person genuinely believes they're confident. They're not performing confidence to hide insecurity. The compensation has become their conscious experience of themselves. But here's the trap Jung identified. As long as the compensation is active, the underlying wound can never be addressed. Because to feel the insecurity would require dropping the compensation. And dropping the compensation feels like losing yourself. So the person is stuck in a double bind. They can maintain the compensation and stay unconscious of the wound, or they can face the wound and experience the terrifying dissolution of the compensatory identity they have built their entire life around. Jung found this mechanism operating in almost every patient who seemed unable to change, despite insight into their patterns. The workaholic who can't slow down because underneath the productivity is a terror of being worthless. The people pleaser who can't set boundaries because underneath the niceness is a belief that their authentic self is unlovable. The intellectual who can't access emotions because underneath the rationality is overwhelming pain they've spent decades avoiding. The compensation isn't the problem. It's actually a brilliant solution the psyche created to manage something that felt unmanageable. But it becomes a block when it prevents you from ever addressing what's underneath it. And most people spend their entire lives strengthening their compensations through therapy, self-help, and personal development, never realizing they're actually moving further from the wholeness they're seeking. The third block Jung identified was shadow projection. This mechanism is so automatic and so invisible that Jung considered it one of the most difficult blocks to recognize and dissolve. Shadow projection is what happens when qualities you can't accept in yourself get unconsciously attributed to other people. And Jung discovered this wasn't just about projecting negative qualities. You also project your unrealized positive qualities, your potential, your power, your gifts onto others, and then resent them for having what's actually yours. Here's how this block operates. You have parts of yourself that your ego has deemed unacceptable. Maybe anger, because you were raised to believe anger is bad. Maybe ambition, because your family shamed people who wanted more. Maybe vulnerability, because being soft got you hurt. These qualities don't disappear just because your ego rejected them. They go into what Jung called the shadow, the part of your psyche that contains everything you've decided isn't you. But shadow content doesn't stay neatly contained. It leaks out through projection. You start seeing the anger, ambition, or vulnerability you can't own in yourself everywhere in other people. And you have intense reactions to it. You judge people who express anger. You resent people who are ambitious. You feel contempt for people who are vulnerable, not because there's actually something wrong with those people, because you're encountering the disowned parts of yourself reflected back to you. And here's how this becomes a block. As long as you're projecting your shadow qualities onto others, you can't integrate them. You're too busy judging them out there to recognize them in here. So you remain fractured, with essential parts of yourself exiled into the shadow, while your conscious personality becomes increasingly rigid and one-dimensional. But it gets worse. Jung found that you don't just project your shadow onto random people. You unconsciously arrange your entire life around your projections. You choose partners who carry your shadow. You attract situations that force you to confront what you've denied. Your psyche is constantly trying to make you whole by bringing you face to face with what you've split off. But as long as you're convinced the problem is out there, you'll never do the internal work that would actually free you. The fourth major block is what Jung called resistance to the self. This one's difficult to explain because it operates at a level most people never access. Jung distinguished between the ego, your conscious sense of I, and the self, the totality of your psyche, conscious and unconscious together. The ego is the part you know. The self is the whole system, including everything you don't know about yourself. Jung observed that the self is constantly trying to move you toward wholeness and actualization. It sends signals through dreams, synchronicities, bodily symptoms, repeating patterns, and that persistent feeling that your life isn't aligned with who you really are. But the ego experiences these signals as threats because wholeness requires the ego to surrender its central organizing position. And the ego is absolutely convinced that if it surrenders control, you'll fall apart. So, resistance to the self manifests as dismissing or ignoring every signal your psyche sends you. You have the dream that shows you exactly what's wrong, but you forget it by breakfast. You experience the synchronicity that points toward your path, but you rationalize it as coincidence. You feel the persistent pull towards something your life needs, but you override it with logic about why that's impractical or impossible. This block is particularly cruel because the very thing that could free you is what you're most defended against. Your own depths are trying to guide you. Your unconscious is offering wisdom your conscious mind can't access. But your ego has been trained to trust only what it knows and can control. So you stay trapped in the limited reality the ego can comprehend, while the vast intelligence of the self goes completely ignored. Jung found that most people only overcome resistance to the self when external life collapses so completely that the ego's control strategies stop working. The breakdown that forces breakthrough, the crisis that cracks you open, the devastation that finally makes you listen to what's been trying to reach you for years. Not because that's the only path, but because most people won't surrender the ego's dominance until they have no other choice. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung. designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. The fifth block Jung documented was identification with the persona. The persona is the social mask you present to the world, the version of yourself that's acceptable, professional, put together. It's not fake exactly, it's a necessary adaptation to social reality. But Jung found that many people become so identified with their persona that they lose contact with who they actually are underneath it. This creates a specific kind of psychological imprisonment. You know how to be the successful professional, the good parent, the spiritual person, the reliable friend, but you have no idea who you are when you're alone with yourself. The persona has become so dominant that it's colonized your entire sense of self, and any attempt to access your authentic self feels like you're becoming someone you're not, when actually you're finally stopping being someone you're not. The block operates through a constant internal performance. Even when you're alone, you're still performing the persona to yourself. You're still being the person you think you should be, still maintaining the image, still upholding the identity. There's no off switch because you've forgotten there's anything underneath the mask to switch to. Jung observed that this block creates a profound emptiness because the persona, no matter how sophisticated or convincing, isn't actually you. It's a construction, and living as a construction is exhausting and meaningless, no matter how successful the construction becomes. But stepping out from behind the mask requires facing the terror that there might be nothing underneath, that the persona might be all there is, that you might have spent so long being who you're supposed to be, that who you actually are has atrophied into nothing. This fear keeps people trapped in personas that stopped fitting years ago. The executive who wants to be an artist but can't let go of the identity they have built. The parent whose kids have grown but who can't imagine life beyond that role. The helper who's built their entire sense of worth around being needed. The persona becomes a prison where you're both the guard and the prisoner, maintaining your own captivity because freedom feels more terrifying than confinement. The sixth major block is the mother/father complex. Jung found that your early relationship with your primary caregivers creates psychological templates that operate autonomously throughout your life. These aren't just memories or influences. They're active structures in your psyche that shape how you perceive reality, relate to others, and make decisions, often in ways that directly contradict your conscious intentions. The mother complex, for instance, might manifest as unconscious beliefs about nurturance, dependence, and autonomy. If your mother was smothering or withholding, your psyche developed specific defenses and adaptations. And those adaptations are still running even though you're an adult who consciously understands they're no longer necessary. You might find yourself unable to accept help or unable to function without it. Unable to trust your own judgment or rigidly insisting you don't need anyone's input. These aren't choices. They're autonomous complexes playing out patterns established decades ago. The father complex operates similarly around authority, competence, and worthiness. Your early experiences with your father or father figure created templates about whether you're capable, whether authority figures are trustworthy, whether success is possible or dangerous. And these templates are filtering everything you experience now through the lens of what was true then. Here's how this becomes a block. You want to change. You want to relate differently, choose differently, be different, but the complex is operating at a level beneath your conscious control. So you have insight into the pattern, you can articulate the wound, you understand the dynamic, but you keep repeating the same responses because the complex is automatically activating based on unconscious triggers that bypass your conscious awareness entirely. Jung emphasized that you can't think your way out of a complex. Insight doesn't dissolve it. Understanding where it came from doesn't make it stop operating. The complex has to be engaged at the level it exists, through the unconscious, through the body, through direct experience of what was never processed. And most people spend years in therapy talking about their complexes, while the complexes themselves remain completely untouched by all that talking. The seventh block is what Jung called psychic inertia. This is the tendency of your psychological system to maintain its current state simply because it's the current state. Change requires energy. It requires dismantling existing structures and building new ones. And your psyche, like any system, conserves energy by defaulting to established patterns, even when those patterns are dysfunctional. Psychic inertia is why you can know exactly what you need to do differently and still not do it. Why you can have profound insights in therapy that evaporate by the time you get to your car. Why you can commit to change and then mysteriously forget that commitment when the moment to act arrives. It's not weakness, it's your psyche choosing the low-energy option of running the existing program, rather than the high-energy option of creating a new one. Jung observed that this inertia increases the longer a pattern has been established. If you've been operating a certain way for 30 years, the psychological groove you've worn is deep. The energy required to climb out of it and create a new path is substantial. And unless you understand that you are fighting against this inertia, you'll interpret your inability to change as personal failure rather than as a natural property of complex systems. The block becomes most obvious when you experience what Jung called the regression response. You do the work, you make progress, you start operating differently. Then something stressful happens, and suddenly you're back in the old pattern as if all the progress never occurred. That's psychic inertia. Under stress, your system defaults to the most established pathways because they require the least energy. The new patterns haven't been practiced enough to become automatic, so the old ones reassert themselves. Most people give up at this point. They see the regression as proof that change isn't possible or isn't real. But Jung would tell you this is exactly when the work becomes most important. The regression isn't failure. It's the predictable response of a system under stress. What matters is what you do after. Do you use the regression as evidence that you can't change? Or do you recognize it as information about how deep the groove is and return to practicing the new pattern with patience for how long genuine rewiring takes? Here's what Jung ultimately understood about psychological blocks. They're not obstacles to overcome through force or positive thinking. They're structures that were created for legitimate reasons and that served important functions. The ego rigidity protected you from destabilization. The compensation allowed you to function despite wounds you couldn't process. The shadow projection kept you from being overwhelmed by rejected parts. The resistance to the self protected the ego from premature dissolution. The persona allowed social survival. The complexes helped you adapt to impossible situations. The inertia conserved psychological energy. These blocks aren't enemies. They're your psyche's brilliant solutions to real problems. But solutions that were adaptive at one point become prisons when circumstances change and the solutions don't. What protected you as a child blocks you as an adult. What helped you survive prevents you from actually living. And you can't just decide to stop being blocked any more than you can decide to stop having an immune system. So, what did Jung say actually works to dissolve these blocks? He was clear that it wasn't willpower, positive affirmations, or conscious effort. Those approaches just engage the blocks at the wrong level. You can't think your way out of structures that operate beneath thought. You can't force change in systems designed to resist force. What Jung found was that blocks dissolve through a process he called integration. This isn't about overcoming or defeating the blocks. It's about understanding them, respecting their original purpose, and consciously deciding to build new structures while honoring what the old ones were protecting. Integration is simultaneously recognizing why the block exists, feeling compassion for the part of you that needed it, and choosing to develop capacity that makes the block unnecessary. For ego rigidity, integration means developing enough psychological flexibility that your sense of self can include change without experiencing it as death. For compensations, it means slowly feeling what's underneath in doses you can metabolize. For shadow projection, it means recognizing in others what you can't yet own in yourself, then slowly bringing that awareness home. For resistance to the self, it means learning to trust the intelligence of your depths instead of only your conscious control. For persona identification, it means gradually allowing authentic self-expression in safe contexts. For complexes, it means recognizing when they're activated and choosing new responses even when the old ones feel automatic. For psychic inertia, it means patient repetition of new patterns until they become as grooved as the old ones. This process is slow. Jung never promised otherwise. These blocks developed over years or decades. They won't dissolve in a weekend workshop or a month of therapy. They require consistent engagement, endless patience, and willingness to work with your psyche rather than against it. But here's what makes the work worth it. These blocks aren't just preventing change. They're consuming massive amounts of your psychological energy. Maintaining ego rigidity is exhausting. Keeping compensations active takes constant effort. Managing shadow projections creates endless conflict. Resisting the self generates that chronic sense that your life isn't yours. Performing the persona depletes you. The complexes hijack your responses. The inertia makes everything harder than it needs to be. When blocks start dissolving, you don't just become capable of change. You reclaim all the energy that was going into maintaining the blocks. Your psychological resources become available for actually living instead of defending. And this is when people experience what Jung called the feeling of coming alive. Not because life got easier, but because they're no longer fighting themselves at every turn. If you're stuck, if you've been trying to change something for years without success, stop blaming yourself for lack of willpower. You're not weak, you're blocked. And the blocks are operating beneath your conscious awareness in ways you can't fight because you can't even see them. But now you know they're there. Now you know what they are. Now you can start engaging them at the level they exist instead of trying to overcome them through approaches that were never designed to work. The psychological blocks that hold you back aren't character flaws, they're structures. And structures, when understood, can be gradually, patiently, compassionately transformed, not through force, through integration, not overnight, through years of consistent work. But Jung believed this work was the most important thing a human being could do. Because on the other side of your blocks isn't just change, It's the life that's been waiting for you to finally stop defending yourself out of living it. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises, inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.